10 Scariest True Stories of 2024. Story 1. The Whispering Man. The house was beautiful, in that way old houses sometimes are. With its faded red bricks and tall, gnarled oak trees surrounding it like sentinels, it looked like something out of a forgotten photograph. The kind of place you might see in a dusty frame at a yard sale. A memory that had long since slipped away. But for Michael Hayes and his family, it was their new beginning. They had left the city behind, the noise, the traffic, the endless, suffocating rush of life. Here, in the small, quiet town of Armitage Hollow, they hoped to rebuild what had been lost. The realtor had been quick to assure them there was nothing to worry about. Yes, the house had a history, a troubled one, but that was all in the past. 3 previous families had owned the property, and each had mysteriously disappeared. The local town rumors said that the house had a way of unsettling its inhabitants, but Michael brushed it off. Old towns always had stories like that. Nothing more than whispers. The first few nights were peaceful. The kind of stillness that makes you wonder if time itself has slowed down. The kids, Emma and Noah, had already claimed their rooms. Noah, the older of the two, grumbled about how strange the house felt, but Emma was enchanted by the large windows and the thick antique curtains. Michael and his wife Sarah were just happy to have a place that felt like home, even if it smelled a little musty and old. It started on the 4th night. Michael was in bed, lying next to Sarah, when he first heard it. Soft at first, like a murmur in the wind, the kind of noise that could be explained away as the house settling, or a branch scratching against the window. But as the minutes dragged on, it became more distinct. A voice. Michael. He sat up, suddenly wide awake, heart racing. His eyes darted to the door, then to the window, but nothing. No one. Sarah stirred beside him, but she was still deep in sleep. He shook it off, thinking it was just the remnants of a dream, a fleeting echo from his subconscious. But then it happened again. This time, louder, clearer. Michael. The voice was coming from upstairs, from the attic. He swallowed hard, not wanting to acknowledge the dread creeping up his spine. He got up slowly, careful not to disturb Sarah, and crept out of the room. The house was still. Too still. The kind of silence that hangs in the air like a heavy curtain, stifling everything around it. As he ascended the stairs, the whisper grew more insistent. A low, rasping voice, slithering through the dark corners of the house, like a secret being told in the dark. The attic door was cracked open, a sliver of darkness beyond it. His pulse quickened. He reached for the door handle, his fingers brushed it. Cold, chilled to the touch, as if the air around it was alive, feeding on his hesitation. He hesitated for only a moment before he threw it open. The attic was empty. Empty, except for a thick layer of dust that covered everything. The old, unused furniture, the forgotten trunks, the tarnished lamps. Nothing moved. The whispers had stopped. Michael exhaled, but the tightness in his chest wouldn't leave. He turned back to the stairs. The house was eerily quiet again. Just his breathing and the distant hum of the refrigerator downstairs. But that night, the whispers came again. And the night after that. It wasn't just a voice anymore. It was a presence, growing stronger with each passing day, pulling at him from the shadows. The strange part was, it was never loud, never obvious. It was always in the periphery, just out of reach. A whisper from the attic, a rustle from the hallway, a faint sound of something moving in the dark. The voice never spoke directly to him again, but he could hear it just beyond his awareness, scratching at the edges of his mind. It wasn't just in the house anymore. It followed him into the yard, into the street, and even into his sleep. It wasn't until the shadows began to appear that Michael realized it wasn't a ghost haunting the house, not a spectral figure or a restless spirit. It was something worse. One evening, as he stood in the kitchen preparing dinner, he saw it out of the corner of his eye, a shadow flickering at the edge of the room. When he turned his head to look, there was nothing. Nothing but the faint reflection of himself in the glass of the kitchen cabinet. But it didn't feel right. His reflection looked different, colder, not quite him. And then the whisper came again, louder now, almost like a growl. "Michael." He turned back to the window, and then he saw it. A man standing at the far end of the yard, staring directly at him from the shadows of the trees. His face was hidden, but Michael could see the shape of him. Tall, dark, too still. He froze, paralyzed by something primal, something deep in his gut telling him to run, to hide. But before he could move, the figure was gone. Just as quickly as it had appeared, it vanished into the dark, leaving only the distant hum of the wind. The whispers continued, the shadows grew, and Michael began to understand the truth. It wasn't the house that was haunted. It was something much older, something that had been here long before any of them. The house had only been its prison. The whispers grew louder, more urgent, until they filled his mind completely. "Michael, come closer." That night, as he lay awake in bed, the shadow appeared again. Not in the yard, but standing at the foot of his bed, inches from his face. He could feel its breath, cold and heavy on his skin. The air around it was thick with the weight of it, as if the room itself had been corrupted. And then it spoke. "You shouldn't have come here." The voice was no longer a whisper, it was a scream. The next morning, the house was empty. Sarah and the children were gone, but there was no sign of struggle. No note. Nothing. Just the house, sitting silently in the dawn light. Michael never left the attic. When the authorities finally arrived, all they found was his body, lifeless and cold, sitting in the corner of the attic, eyes wide open, staring into the dark where the whispers still echoed. And as they closed the door, locking it once more, the wind picked up, and the whispers once again began to stir. Story 2. The Disappearing Campers. In the early summer of 2024, a group of 5 college students set out for a weekend camping trip. They were all familiar with the wilderness, or so they thought. The place they chose was a remote, heavily forested area deep in the Appalachians. It wasn't particularly famous, but it had a reputation for something else, something strange. Locals spoke of hikers and campers who had ventured into those woods, only to vanish without a trace. The stories were told in whispers, cautionary tales passed down through generations. But to these students, it was just a legend, a myth, something to laugh off around the campfire. As they pitched their tents, set up their campfire, and settled in for the evening, none of them paid much attention to the stories. There was no fear in their voices, only the anticipation of a good time. The stars above them were brighter than any they'd seen in the city. The night felt calm, almost peaceful, as they roasted marshmallows and told stories. The shadows around them were deep, but they had no reason to worry. They had done this many times before. There was no reason to think that tonight would be any different. But it was. By morning, they were gone. When the search teams arrived, there was no sign of the campers. No footprints, no trail, no indication of where they had gone. The only thing that remained was their camp, still intact, as if they had left only moments ago. The fire was still burning, the embers glowing faintly in the early morning light. Their backpacks, tents, and even their phones were untouched. No struggle, no sign of a disturbance. It was as if they had simply disappeared, vanishing into thin air. The search team scoured the surrounding area for hours, but it was as if the woods had swallowed them whole. Then, one of the volunteers found something that shouldn't have been there. It was a tree, a tall, gnarled thing, standing alone at the edge of the camp. On its bark, someone had carved a message. "The night speaks. Listen." The message was cryptic, haunting, and it made the hairs on the back of the volunteer's neck stand up. What did it mean? Who had carved it? Why? They found no further clues, and after days of searching, the authorities were forced to call off the investigation. The group had simply vanished. The news stories faded. The campus mourned the loss of 5 young people, but life continued, as it always does. The case was filed away as one more unsolved mystery, and for a time, that was the end of it. A year later, another group of hikers, a different set of college students, decided to camp in the same area. It was almost as if they hadn't heard the stories, or worse, they thought they could conquer whatever had caused the first group to disappear. They arrived at the same campsite, unaware of the past that lingered there. At first, everything seemed fine. They laughed, talked, drank, and set up their camp just like the others had. But soon, something felt off. There was a heaviness in the air, a weight that none of them could shake. One of the hikers, Maria, kept hearing strange noises from the woods. Whispers, murmurs, just barely audible, as if the trees themselves were speaking. At night, the wind would rustle the Leavenworth, but there was something wrong about it. It wasn't the normal sound of the forest. It was deliberate, almost like a voice. She mentioned it to the others, but they laughed it off. "You're just spooked from the stories," one of them said. "There's nothing out there." Still, Maria couldn't shake the feeling. When she lay in her tent, she swore she could hear the whispers, faint and distant, as though someone was calling her name from the darkness. Her breath would catch in her chest, but when she looked out the flap of the tent, there was nothing. Just the trees, standing silently in the night. The next morning, they were gone. The search teams found the same thing as before. No sign of struggle, no clues as to what had happened. Their camp was undisturbed, the fire still smoldering in the center of the site. The only difference was a message carved into another tree, a few yards away. "The night speaks. Listen." The authorities were stunned. The eerie connection between the 2 disappearances couldn't be ignored. A year apart, in the same place, with the same message. But no one could explain it. No one could figure out how or why. As the months passed, rumors began to spread. Some said that the woods had a life of their own, that the land was cursed or haunted by something ancient. Others claimed that the disappearances weren't random, that the night itself, the darkness that filled the trees, was alive, a malevolent force that consumed the unwary. There were whispers that the message was a warning, a plea to listen, to acknowledge that something was out there, waiting, listening. And then a third group of hikers, curious but cautious, decided to camp near the same area. They never returned. There was no fire left burning that time, no traces, just the forest. Silent. Still. The woods, it seemed, were never done with their secrets. The message had not changed. It never would. The night speaks. Listen. Story 3, The Silence in the Apartment. Maya Bennett had never thought much about the quietness of the city. It was one of those things that you simply accepted when you moved to a busy place like downtown. There was always some background noise, the distant hum of traffic, the occasional siren, people talking as they passed on the street below her window. It was the kind of noise that became a part of your everyday life. You didn't hear it so much as feel it. She had moved in just a week ago, to an old but charming apartment building on Birchwood Avenue. the rent was reasonable, and the place had a certain character: creaky wooden floors, high ceilings, old-fashioned fixtures. It was exactly what she needed. Affordable, in a decent location, and most importantly, hers. At first, it felt like any other new place. The sounds of the city seeped in through the cracked window panes, and the occasional murmur of neighbors passing in the hallway filtered through the thin walls. It felt comforting in a way, like she was part of something, even if she didn't know anyone. But then, a few days later, something started to change. It was subtle at first. The sound seemed quieter. Maya would wake up in the middle of the night, and the usual city noise, the distant honk of horns, the shuffle of footsteps outside, was strangely absent. It was the kind of silence that felt oppressive, like the city itself was holding its breath. It wasn't just outside. The building felt different too. The hallways, which had been filled with the usual hum of voices and the thud of footsteps, grew quiet. At first, Maya didn't think much of it. Maybe the other tenants were just out. Maybe the thin walls were finally settling. But as the days passed, the silence only deepened. By the end of the week, she could count on one hand the number of times she'd heard anyone move around, above, below, or beside her. The elevator was always empty when she stepped in, the hallways eerily still. No one came and went. No one knocked on doors. The building had become a strange, vacant place, as if it were waiting for something. Maya tried to brush it off. She told herself it was nothing. Maybe the tenants had just moved out, or maybe she was being paranoid. But then, on the 7th night, the voice came. She had been lying in bed, trying to sleep, when she heard it. A whisper, faint but distinct, coming from the wall beside her bed. The voice was soft, almost tender, but it carried a terrible weight. "You're the last one here." Maya froze, her heart pounding in her chest. The voice was so clear, so close, that she could almost feel its breath on her skin. She sat up slowly, eyes wide, staring at the blank wall. Her mind raced, trying to rationalize it. But the voice had sounded so real, so alive. Her apartment was still, too still. There was no sound now, no city hum, no soft shuffle of footsteps. Only the heavy silence pressing in around her. The next morning, Maya couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. It wasn't just the silence. It was the sense that something was lurking, just out of sight. Something ancient and forgotten hidden in the walls of the building. She decided to report it to the landlord, a grizzled old man who had been managing the building for decades. His office was tucked away in the corner of the lobby, where the air always smelled faintly of mothballs and old paper. When she told him about the silence, his expression didn't change. But when she mentioned the whisper, his face paled just for a second. "That voice," he began, his voice hesitant. "You're not the first to hear it." Maya stared at him, puzzled. "What do you mean?" The landlord sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. "This building's nearly empty, you know. Has been for years. Tenants move in, but they don't stay long. They leave, almost all of them. Something about this place, it drives people away. You're the last one in your section. The others all left in the past few months. But one tenant has been here longer than anyone. Decades, in fact." He leaned forward, his voice dropping to a whisper. Her name was Eleanor. She lived here, alone, for over 30 years. But, well, she's not here anymore. Maya felt a chill run down her spine. What happened to her? The landlord hesitated. "I don't know. She just disappeared one day. No note, no warning. She was gone. But the apartment's been empty ever since. And the strangest thing..." He trailed off, his voice barely above a murmur. There's something in the walls. I think she's still here somehow." Maya felt her blood run cold. "Still here? What do you mean?" The landlord's eyes flicked to the door, as if he expected someone to come through at any moment. He leaned in closer. "The night speaks. It speaks to those who listen. Eleanor, she listened. She heard it too. And maybe, just maybe, she never really left." Maya's heart thudded painfully in her chest. She turned to leave, but as she did, she caught a glimpse of the landlord's face. A face twisted in fear, as if he knew something she didn't, something he couldn't bear to say. Back in her apartment, the silence felt different now. Heavy. It wasn't just the absence of noise. It was as though something was waiting, watching, waiting for her to hear it again. The whisper, the voice, the message. And then, just as she sat down on the couch, she heard it again. This time, it wasn't from the walls. It was coming from behind her. "You're not alone." Maya spun around, her breath catching in her throat. But there was nothing there. The silence settled in once more, thick and suffocating. Was she truly alone? The walls, it seemed, had the answer. Story 4. The Stalker's Photograph. Lena Collins had always been drawn to the decaying beauty of abandoned buildings. As a photographer, she found something haunting in their silence. The way time seemed to hold its breath, as if the world had forgotten them, but the walls still remembered. For months, she had wandered through these forgotten places, capturing their secrets on film. There was something cathartic about it, something that made her feel connected to a past she could never touch. On a chilly autumn afternoon, she found herself standing in front of an old mansion on the outskirts of town. It was a crumbling thing, the windows boarded up, the stone facade cracked and weathered. Local legends swirled about the mansion, about a family that had vanished without a trace decades ago, leaving behind only the echo of their lives. People said the house was cursed, that strange things happened to those who ventured too close. But Lena wasn't afraid. She had grown used to the stories. She was here for the photo, not the ghost stories. She stepped carefully through the front door, her camera bag slung over her shoulder. Inside, the air was thick with dust, the light filtering through the cracks in the walls, casting long shadows on the floor. As she moved through the mansion, taking shots of the crumbling interior, her mind wandered. She thought about the family who had lived here, wondered what their lives had been like before everything was abandoned. It was in what had once been the family's library that she found it. Buried under a pile of rubble, old, broken furniture, books strewn across the floor, was an old, framed photograph. She reached down and brushed the dust off the glass, revealing a family portrait. A man, a woman, and 2 children stood together, their faces frozen in a moment from the past. But it was the man's face that stopped Lena's heart. She knew him. At first, she couldn't place it. She stared at the photograph, the familiarity of his face gnawing at her. The sharp features, the deep-set eyes, the way his expression seemed to hang between warmth and something darker. And then it hit her. The man in the photograph was the same man who had been following her for months. The man she had seen in the background of her photos, in the shadows of alleyways, standing on street corners just as she passed by. At first, she thought he was just another stranger, a coincidence, a passerby, a face in the crowd. But then, he started showing up more often. Always in the background of her shots, never close enough to be a clear figure, but always there, like a shadow lingering just out of reach. The first time she saw him was after a late-night shoot near the old city bridge. She thought she was imagining things, just another face in the dark. But after that night, it became undeniable. He was always there, waiting. But this photograph, this was different. The man in the portrait was standing beside a woman and two children. The scene was set in what looked like a grand, long-forgotten living room. The furniture in the photograph was opulent, a sharp contrast to the ruin Lena was standing in now. But it wasn't just the man's familiar face that chilled her. It was the way the other people in the picture seemed to look at her. Their eyes, the children's, the woman's, were they staring at her? No, that couldn't be possible. They were decades old, but they seemed to know her. She stared at the photograph, trying to make sense of it. Why was it still so clear? The edges of the photo were worn, yes, but the faces were as sharp as if it had been taken yesterday. She couldn't take her eyes off the man, the way his gaze seemed to follow her, even from the picture. And the chill running through her spine told her that something was terribly wrong. She turned the photograph over, her hands trembling. The back was covered in faded writing, too worn to make out all the words, but one thing was clear. For Lena, with love. Her heart skipped a beat. Lena wasn't sure how long she stood there, staring at the photograph, but it felt like hours. The room around her seemed to grow colder, and the silence of the mansion seemed to press in on her from all sides. Then, without warning, a shadow shifted at the edge of her vision. She jerked her head to the side. There, standing in the doorway of the library, was the man. Her breath caught in her throat. He wasn't just a shadow in the background anymore. He was real, standing right there in front of her, his face expressionless, his eyes locked on hers. She tried to speak, but her voice wouldn't come. She backed away, stumbling over debris, her camera slipping from her shoulder and hitting the floor with a loud crash. But the man didn't move. He just stood there, watching her, his eyes cold and unblinking. Slowly, she turned and ran, her heart hammering in her chest. She didn't know where she was going, but all she could think about was getting out of that house, away from that face, from the horrible connection that now tied her to him. When Lena finally made it outside, the sun was setting, casting long shadows across the lawn. She turned back to look at the mansion, the wind whispering through the trees. But the house was silent now. She was alone. Or at least she thought she was. In her hands, she still clutched the photograph. And in the distance, standing by the window, she thought she saw him again. The man from the photograph. His face now pressed against the glass, watching her. He wasn't just following her anymore, he was waiting for her. And this time, there was nowhere to run. Story 5. The Man in the Mirror. It began with something small, insignificant even. Evan Rayner, a man in his mid-30s, had always been someone who didn't pay much attention to the details of his life. He went through his daily routine like most people: work, a quick dinner, a few hours of TV, and sleep. Life was simple, predictable. But in the summer of 2024, things started to change. It was a Tuesday evening when it first happened. Evan stood in his bathroom, brushing his teeth, the familiar hum of the bathroom fan overhead. He glanced into the mirror above the sink, as he always did. But something was different. His reflection wasn't quite right. His hand, moving with the brush, had a slight delay. It was subtle enough that at first he thought he might have imagined it. A moment passed. Then he moved his eyes, watching himself. His reflection followed, but there was something off about it. A brief hesitation, as if his reflection wasn't entirely in sync with him. It was small, a twitch of the eye, a shift of the head that felt out of place. Evan shook it off. It was nothing, just his tired mind playing tricks on him. But over the following days, it became impossible to ignore. It was always there, lurking in the glass. His reflection no longer moved in perfect harmony with him. It was as though it had a mind of its own. The delays were getting longer. The smallest movements, when he reached to scratch his cheek or tilt his head, would be mimicked just a moment too late. At times, the reflection seemed almost too deliberate, as if it was studying him. The first time it truly unsettled him was when he was getting ready for bed. He had just turned off the light, and as he stood in front of the mirror one last time, his reflection didn't move with him. He looked at his reflection. The image of himself stood still, staring back. He reached out, touching the mirror's surface. His reflection did nothing. That was when the panic began. He backed away, watching his reflection remain fixed in place. For a moment, Evan felt the unmistakable sense that he was being watched, but not by himself. The reflection stood there, waiting. It wasn't him anymore, it was something else. Something cold and calculating. Evan tried to tell himself it was just his imagination, but the next morning it happened again. He stood in front of the mirror, preparing for work, and noticed that his reflection was smiling, just slightly, but enough to make him freeze. He hadn't smiled. It wasn't a comforting expression, but something more twisted, almost mocking. The reflection's movements became more distinct. It no longer just mimicked him. It seemed to have its own agenda. The more Evan tried to ignore it, the more aggressive it became. When he looked into the mirror, the reflection would move before he did, almost as if it was eager to show him something. At times, it would distort, stretching its face into an expression Evan couldn't quite place. It wasn't a smile anymore, it was a grimace, a sneer. Evan tried to escape. He avoided mirrors. He even removed the one from his bathroom, convinced that the reflection couldn't follow him without it. But the reflection still haunted him. Whenever he found himself in front of another mirror, at work, in store windows, in the car's rear view, there it was. That same expression. It would follow him like a shadow until he couldn't breathe. The more he ran, the closer it came. The reflection had begun to move without him, pacing in the mirror like it was waiting for him to step back into the room. He could feel it in every room of his house, even in the windows, as if it was slowly slipping into his reality inch by inch. Evan tried to hide from it, to escape, but the reflection grew more persistent. He couldn't sleep, he couldn't eat. Every time he closed his eyes, it was there in his mind's eye, watching him, waiting. One evening, he finally broke. He stood in front of his largest mirror, staring at the reflection that wasn't him. He had to confront it, had to see if it was real. His heart raced as he reached out to touch the glass. And for the first time, his reflection reached out as well. It was cold. His hand touched the surface of the mirror, and then it wasn't just the reflection anymore. The glass. It rippled. The surface trembled, as if something was pushing from the other side. Something was trying to get through. In that moment, everything became clear to Evan. The reflection was no longer just a mere image. It had become something else. A thing, a presence that had taken hold of him. He wasn't looking at himself anymore. He was looking at the thing that had been waiting in the shadows of his own image, biding its time. As he stepped back, the reflection didn't follow. It remained there, frozen, watching him. And as he turned to leave the room, he could hear it. Soft, almost imperceptible, but there. A whisper in the air. "You can't run from me." Evan felt it then, the cold grip of reality slipping away. The reflection had crossed into his world. He wasn't alone anymore. The man in the mirror had come to stay. Story 6. The Crying House. Ellen and Mark Thompson had never thought much about the idea of history when it came to a home. They had both grown up in modern houses, places that were built to be comfortable and functional, not steeped in the past. But when they found the old Victorian house on the outskirts of town, something about it drew them in. It was spacious, with large windows that let in light, and a yard full of towering trees. The price was right, and the neighborhood was quiet. It felt like the perfect place to start fresh. The realtor had warned them. "The house has a bit of history," she'd said, her tone vague. "Some odd things happen here, but nothing that should worry you. Just the usual rumors, you know. Old houses have their stories." They hadn't paid much attention to that. A few strange noises, a creak in the floorboards. It was all part of an old house settling. They were excited to move in, to make the space their own. The first few nights were peaceful. The house was quieter than they expected for such an old place, the kind of quiet that feels like a blanket wrapping around you. But then, on the fourth night, something shifted. It started with a sound, a faint crying, soft and distant, like a child calling out in the dark. At first, they thought it was just the wind, or maybe some sound from outside, but as the night wore on, the crying grew louder, clearer. It was unmistakable now, a child sobbing, lost in the night. Ellen and Mark exchanged uneasy glances. Neither of them had heard anything like it before, and the house felt different somehow, as if the air itself had thickened. They tried to ignore it at first, telling themselves it was just an old house, settling again, or the pipes making strange noises. But the cries continued, echoing through the walls. The next few nights the crying didn't stop. It grew louder, more desperate, as if the child was trapped somewhere, calling out for help. It came from everywhere. Above them, below them, from the corners of the house. It was coming from inside the walls. By the time they called in a contractor to investigate, they were both on edge. The house felt oppressive, heavy with something they couldn't understand. The cries were driving them both to the edge of their sanity. The contractor, an older man with years of experience, agreed to help them. They tore open one of the walls in the living room, hoping to find a broken pipe or some other explanation. What they found instead sent chills down their spines. Behind the wall, hidden from view for decades, was a small nursery. The room was decayed, the wallpaper peeling, the furniture old and covered in dust, but it was unmistakably a child's room. The crib was still there, the tiny rocking chair placed in the corner, and a faded blanket lay on the floor. But what was more unsettling than the room itself was the air. It felt stagnant, cold, as if the room had been waiting, holding its breath, for someone to open the door. The cries stopped as soon as the wall came down, as if the act of opening the room had somehow silenced the sound. But something was wrong. Something wasn't right. The room wasn't just empty, it had a presence, something that lingered in the corners. Something that had been waiting all these years for someone to disturb it. Mark stepped into the room, his heart racing. "What happened here?" he whispered. Ellen stood behind him, trembling, unable to speak. They learned from the old town records that the house's previous owners had once had a child, a little girl, who had died tragically under mysterious circumstances. There were rumors, whispers in the town about the child's death. A drowning in the nearby creek, an accident, or perhaps something darker. The parents had moved away shortly after the tragedy, leaving the house behind. The room, the nursery, had been left untouched. But now it seemed the child's spirit had never left. The cries began again that night, but this time they were different. Louder, more insistent. They came from the nursery, from behind the walls as if the child was trapped again, unable to escape. Ellen and Mark tried to leave, but they couldn't. The house held them, kept them in place, as if it was feeding off their fear. The cries grew more frantic and the air grew colder. They couldn't shake the feeling that something was there, in the shadows, something waiting. And then they heard it. A soft, whispering voice so faint it was almost lost in the cries. It was the voice of a child, but it wasn't just a child's voice. It was something else. "Come play with me," the voice said. Ellen and Mark tried to leave again, but the door wouldn't open. The house, it seemed, had other plans for them. The walls, once so silent, began to shift, to change. The nursery's presence had seeped into the rest of the house, filling every room with a cold, oppressive weight. The cries, the whispers, the feeling of being watched. It was all too much. They were trapped. And as the hours stretched on, they realized that the house wasn't just haunted, it was hungry. It had waited for years, and now it was calling them in, drawing them deeper into its dark heart. The child's cries echoed around them, the voice growing louder, closer. "Come play with me," it repeated. But there was no escape now. The house had taken them in, and the child's cries were no longer just cries. They were the sound of the house, the sound of the walls themselves, slowly closing in. And they knew there would be no going back. Story 7. The Message from the Dead. It had been 2 years since they lost Emma. 2 years since the accident that took their only daughter, the car crash that left her broken and silent, her life snuffed out like a candle in the wind. Time had blurred the pain into something hollow. Empty spaces, unspoken words, a house too quiet, too still. Her parents, Karen and David, tried to move forward. They kept the house, the one Emma had grown up in, though it felt more like a mausoleum than a home. Every corner reminded them of her laughter that once filled the rooms, the echo of her footsteps on the stairs. But as the days passed, they learned to live with the silence, though it never felt right. It was Karen who first noticed the texts. It was late one evening, just after dinner. David had gone upstairs to his office, and Karen was cleaning up in the kitchen when her phone buzzed on the counter. She glanced at it, expecting a message from a friend, but instead it was a text from Emma's old number. She froze. The text was simple, almost innocuous. "Hey Mom, how's it going?" Karen's heart skipped a beat. Her hands trembled as she stared at the message. Emma's number, her phone. How could this be possible? She hadn't saved Emma's phone, hadn't been able to let it go, and now, this? She called David immediately, but by the time he came downstairs, the message had disappeared. He chalked it up to a glitch, some mistake with the phone. But Karen couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. The phone was off. She had made sure of it. Emma's phone, her things, everything had been put away after the funeral. A few days passed, and then it happened again. Another text. This time it was an old selfie Emma had taken just a few weeks before the accident, smiling in their living room, her face full of life and hope. Karen's breath caught in her chest. This wasn't possible. It wasn't just a simple text. It was a memory. One of Emma's last. David was less willing to accept the impossible. He insisted that the phone must have been hacked somehow. Maybe someone had taken her number and was messing with them. He dismissed it. But Karen couldn't. She started receiving more messages. The tone was always different. Odd. Almost like Emma was trying to reach them from somewhere. Somewhere beyond the veil. The texts became more personal. They started small, harmless. Comments about their day, about things Emma had loved, like the way Karen had always made her favorite meal. But as time went on, the messages grew more specific, more chilling. "You left the light on in the basement again," one said. "I can see you sitting on the couch, just like you used to." The hair on the back of Karen's neck stood up. She would never have sent those texts, never would have known about the small details of the house that Emma used to notice when no one else would. But Emma's phone, her number, was sending them. Then came the breaking point. It was a late afternoon, just as the sun was dipping below the horizon, casting long shadows over the house. Karen had been in the kitchen prepping dinner when her phone buzzed again. This time, the text was simple, but the words were enough to make her blood run cold. "David's upstairs. He's not alone." Karen's hands shook as she looked at the message. She knew David was home, but the unsettling thing was that she had been in the kitchen the entire time. There was no one else in the house, or so she thought. Slowly, she picked up the phone, her breath coming in shallow gasps, and she dialed David. He picked up immediately. His voice was strained. "Karen, I'm not alone." Her heart stopped. "What do you mean? Who's with you?" David didn't answer right away. She could hear muffled sounds on the other end, scraping, something heavy being moved, a slow, dragging noise. And then, in the background, the faintest sound of a voice. Soft, almost a whisper. The voice wasn't his. "David?" Karen's voice cracked. "What's happening?" The line went silent for a long, terrifying moment. When he spoke again, his voice was hoarse, barely a whisper. "I can't explain it. It's not just the phone, Karen. I saw her." Karen's blood ran cold. "Saw who?" There was a long pause. "Emma." Karen's mind raced. "What are you talking about? She's gone, David. I know," he interrupted, his voice trembling. "But she's here, in the house." Karen was already running toward the stairs before she even realized it. Every fiber of her being screamed to turn back, to run away from whatever this was. But she couldn't. She had to know. She had to face it. When she reached the top of the stairs, she found David standing in the hallway, staring at the door to Emma's old room. The door was ajar, and from within, the unmistakable sound of her daughter's laughter echoed, faint but real. The phone in Karen's pocket buzzed again. She didn't need to look at the screen to know what it would say. "I'm waiting for you." The texts had stopped, but as Karen stepped into the room, the house felt alive. Alive with something that shouldn't have been there. In the corner of the room, something shifted, something out of place. And in that moment, Karen realized that the messages hadn't come from Emma's phone at all. They had come from something else. Something that had been waiting for them to open the door, and now they had. Story 8, The Haunting of Room 207. The town of Ashford wasn't known for much. It was small, quiet, tucked away from the world. There were no big attractions or exciting landmarks, just a few shops, a diner, and a hotel that had been standing for as long as anyone could remember. The Ashford Inn wasn't anything special, just a place to stay for travelers passing through. But there was something strange about the hotel, something that made it infamous among locals, something that no one wanted to talk about. Room 207. Guests who checked into the Ashford Inn would leave, but not the same. They'd be disoriented, confused, their faces pale and etched with fear. Some couldn't even remember their time in the room. Others couldn't speak of it at all, as if words failed them. They'd check in, but they wouldn't check out the same. And the ones who did stay there never stayed for long. No one was willing to spend more than one night in room 207. The room was said to be cursed. People spoke of strange noises, of whispers that could be heard through the walls, of visions that would haunt you long after you left. But it was more than that. Something in room 207 seemed to know you, your deepest fears, your darkest regrets. It dug into your soul, leaving an imprint that you couldn't wash away. Over the years, no one who stayed there for any length of time had left unchanged. The room had a way of getting under your skin, of revealing things that were buried deep inside. Enter Daniel Harper. Daniel was a journalist, a writer with a reputation for chasing down the strange and the supernatural. When he first heard about the rumors surrounding room 207, he was skeptical. It was just another ghost story, another urban legend, but there was something about it that intrigued him, something that felt like it needed to be uncovered. So, one cold fall evening, Daniel arrived at the Ashford Inn. He checked in, paid for the room, and was given the key to 207. The old hotel creaked and groaned as he walked down the narrow hallway, the lights flickering above him, casting long shadows on the walls. When he reached the door to room 207, he hesitated for a moment, but only for a moment. He wasn't afraid. The room was small, sparsely furnished. A bed with a simple frame, a wooden dresser, a small desk by the window. The air felt still, stale, as if it hadn't been disturbed in years. He sat on the bed and set up his equipment, his recorder, his notebook, his camera, and began to take notes. The plan was to spend the night in the room, document everything he experienced, and see if the rumors were true. It started slowly, as most things do. At first, there was nothing unusual. The room felt cold, but that was to be expected in an old building. He wrote in his notebook, tried to capture his thoughts. But then came the whispers. Soft, distant at first, as if coming from the other side of the walls. It was almost imperceptible, so much so that Daniel thought he might have imagined it. But then, it came again. The whispers seemed to grow louder. At times, it sounded like his own name, but twisted. "Daniel," they would whisper. He looked around the room, but it was empty. Just him in the room, nothing. He tried to focus on his work, but the whispers didn't stop. And then, he saw it. A figure. At first, it was just a shadow, a shape in the corner of his eye. But when he turned to look, it was gone. He stood up, his heart racing, and checked the door. It was locked. He opened the window, trying to get some fresh air, but the night outside seemed too still, too quiet. The whispers kept coming, and soon the room began to change. The air thickened, growing heavier, suffocating. The temperature dropped. Daniel felt the weight of the room press down on him, as if the walls were closing in. He could feel something watching him, something that knew him. The reflection of his own face in the window seemed different, twisted. He stepped closer, looking at himself in the glass, but it wasn't him. Not really. The man in the reflection had eyes that weren't his, a look of anguish, of fear, that Daniel didn't recognize. He staggered back, trying to make sense of it all. But then, the room shifted again. The walls seemed to close in around him, the shadows growing longer, more oppressive. His heart pounded in his chest as he turned to leave, but the door wouldn't open. It was stuck. The room, the hotel, the town, they were all suffocating him. As the night wore on, Daniel couldn't shake the feeling that something was drawing closer, something inside the room. He tried to leave, but he couldn't. The more he struggled, the more he was pulled into the depths of his own mind. The room had become a mirror, reflecting all his darkest memories, his hidden fears. He saw things in the reflection that he hadn't thought about in years. Regrets, mistakes, things he had buried deep. And as he looked closer, he saw her, his sister, the one he had lost, the one he had never forgiven himself for abandoning. She was there, standing in the corner of the room, her eyes wide with a sadness that cut into him like a knife. She reached out to him, but he couldn't move. He couldn't escape. By the time morning came, the room was empty again. Daniel stumbled out of the room 207, disoriented, pale, and trembling. He was different. He wasn't the same man who had walked into that room the night before. He tried to leave, to escape the hotel, but he found himself drawn back to the hallway. The whispers followed him. No one stays in room 207 for long. And those who do leave, they leave changed. Daniel never spoke about what happened that night, but he never stopped looking over his shoulder. The reflection of his past, of his regrets, would follow him forever. And room 207 had shown him that some things, some memories, are never meant to be escaped. Story 9. The Vanishing Commuter. For years, Daniel had followed the same routine. Every morning, he would wake up at 6 a.m., the same way he had for as long as he could remember. He would shower, dress in his suit, and leave his small apartment by 7 o'clock, just in time to catch the 7:15 train. The same seat, the same route. Every day, without fail. It was the kind of routine that people like Daniel found comfort in. Predictable, unchanging. The rhythmic sound of the train, the soft hum of voices around him, the passing scenery. It was all so familiar, like a worn-out photograph he'd looked at 1,000 times. The train had been part of his life for as long as he could remember, a constant that anchored him in the world. But one day, something shifted. Something he couldn't quite explain. It began when the train arrived at his usual stop. Daniel stood up from his seat, like he always did, ready to step off the train and into his day. But as he walked down the aisle toward the door, something felt wrong. The usual sights and sounds of his stop, the familiar buildings, the street signs, the faces of people waiting to get on, were gone. The doors opened and Daniel stepped off the train, but the world that greeted him was not the one he expected. The streets around him looked unfamiliar, strange. The buildings were different, taller, narrower. He glanced around, trying to find something, anything that he recognized. But there was nothing. The air felt thick, heavy with a sense of wrongness, as though the city had changed overnight, as though he had stepped into another version of it. Daniel's heart began to race. He knew this area. He walked these streets every day, but now everything was alien. He tried to calm himself, telling himself that it was probably just some minor mistake, some small thing he had overlooked. He turned to walk back toward the train station, hoping to get on the next train and retrace his steps. But as he walked, things got worse. The streets twisted and turned in ways he didn't recognize. The buildings seemed to loom over him, closing in. There was no sign of the familiar landmarks he passed every morning. No signs of the cafes, the shops, or the small park where he always saw the same man sitting on the same bench. Panic gripped him. He pulled out his phone and tried to call home. Maybe his wife, Claire, could help him make sense of what was happening. But as the phone rang, he noticed something strange. The number on the screen wasn't Claire's. It was a number he didn't recognize. Hesitant, he answered. "Hello?" he said, his voice shaky. A voice on the other end answered, but it wasn't Claire. It was a woman, someone he didn't know. "Hello?" she asked, her tone cold, distant. "Who is this?" Confusion flooded Daniel. "It's me, Daniel. Where's Claire? Where's my family?" There was a long pause on the other end of the line. Then the woman's voice came again, quieter this time. "I'm sorry, but I don't know who you are. Who did you say you were?" Daniel's breath caught in his throat. "This is my number, my phone. What's going on?" The woman didn't answer. Instead, there was a soft, almost imperceptible click on the line, and then the call disconnected. Daniel stood there, his phone in his hand, feeling the blood drain from his face. Something was terribly wrong. He dialed his home number, but the same strange voice answered again, this time telling him there was no such number. His fingers trembled as he tried to send a text message to Claire, but when he looked at his phone, the message had changed. It wasn't from him. It was from his wife, but the words made no sense. "Who is this?" it read. "Where have you been?" In a panic, Daniel turned and ran back toward the train station, hoping, praying that it would be there. But when he reached the platform, he saw that the tracks were empty. The train he had ridden was nowhere in sight. He waited for what felt like hours, staring down the tracks, but nothing came. The train was gone. The world around him felt even more distant now, as if it was slipping away from him, like the city was slowly erasing itself. Frantic, Daniel tried to make sense of what was happening. He tried to catch a cab to get back home, but the streets didn't lead him anywhere he recognized. The city had become a labyrinth, and he was lost in it. As the sun began to set, Daniel found himself standing in front of a building he didn't recognize. The street sign read something he couldn't understand. He looked up, his breath coming in ragged gasps, and that's when he saw it. The reflection of himself in the glass doors of the building. It wasn't his face. Not really. His face was older, worn, as if he had lived 100 years in a single day. The eyes staring back at him weren't his. They were dark, hollow, full of something empty. The reflection didn't move with him. It stayed where it was, staring back at him, frozen in place. Daniel took a step back, his head spun. And then he realized he wasn't just lost, he was gone. The world around him had faded, the city, his family, his life. Everything had slipped away, leaving nothing but a cold, empty reflection, staring back at him from a place that was no longer real. He had vanished. Story 10. The Visitor. Lena had always enjoyed the quiet of living alone. She liked the solitude, the peace it brought after a long day of work. Her apartment was small but cozy, tucked away on the second floor of an aging building in a quiet neighborhood. The kind of place that was just far enough from the city to be peaceful, but still close enough to everything she needed. There was something comforting about the hum of city life in the distance, the soft rustling of the leaves outside her window, the way the moonlight filtered through the curtains at night. But lately, that quiet had been disturbed. It started a few months ago. At first, it was nothing more than a faint knock on the door every few weeks. Lena had thought little of it. Neighbors coming and going, perhaps someone with a package, a mistake. Just one of those things. But as the weeks passed, the knocks grew more frequent. Every few days, then almost nightly. Soft, hesitant, almost as if the person on the other side wasn't sure whether to announce themselves. Each time, Lena would go to the door, press her ear against the wood, and listen. But there was no one there. She started to check the peephole. Nothing. Not a soul in sight. At first, she brushed it off. Maybe it was a prank. Maybe it was just the wind. But something gnawed at her, a feeling she couldn't quite shake. Every time she opened the door, the quiet of the hallway was unnerving. Nothing but shadows stretching across the floor, the faint scent of something stale in the air. Then, it started happening more regularly. Knocks, soft and persistent, came almost every night. The rhythmic sound would echo in the silence of the apartment, a sharp contrast to the peaceful stillness she'd once enjoyed. She could feel her heartbeat quicken each time, the sound of the knocks louder in her ears, as if they were coming from inside her head. One evening, she decided to open the door. She wasn't sure why, maybe to prove to herself that she wasn't imagining things. Maybe because she thought it was time to confront whatever or whoever was causing this. She opened it slowly, peering into the hallway, but again, there was no one. Only the dim light from the stairwell and the deepening shadows in the corners of the walls. But then, she saw something. On the doorstep lay a small object, a delicate piece of jewelry, a silver necklace with a tiny charm shaped like a crescent moon. It was out of place, odd, as if it didn't belong there. Lena picked it up, her fingers brushing against the cool metal. It was old, worn, but undeniably beautiful. She frowned, confused. Who would leave something like this on her doorstep? As she examined it, she noticed something else. A small scrap of paper, folded neatly beside the necklace. She unfolded it carefully, her breath catching in her throat when she saw what was written. A symbol. A strange, incomprehensible symbol, drawn in hurried strokes, its meaning unclear. The lines twisted in ways that didn't make sense, as if they were from another language, another time. She had no idea what it meant, but the unease crept deeper into her chest. She couldn't explain it, but something about the symbol felt wrong. The knocking continued, now every night without fail. She started to grow more restless, more anxious. Every time she opened the door, the hallway remained empty. But each time, there was something new. A ring, a key, a small stone. Objects that seemed completely random, yet each one felt intentional, as though they were left for her. Each one had its own significance, though she couldn't figure out what it was. The pieces didn't fit together, and the mystery began to consume her thoughts. One night, she sat by the door, waiting, her eyes locked on the peephole. The knock came, soft and insistent, and she stood up slowly, her hand trembling as she reached for the doorknob. She wasn't sure what she was expecting to find. She knew no one would be there. She had stopped expecting anything else. When she opened the door, her breath caught in her throat. There was a note, neatly folded, lying on the ground. She picked it up with trembling hands and unfolded it. The handwriting was familiar, though she couldn't place it. The words were simple, but chilling. "It's time to open the door. You know who I am." Lena stood frozen for a moment, the note heavy in her hands. The words seemed to echo in her mind, a sickening familiarity crawling under her skin. She thought she recognized the handwriting. It was a voice she had long forgotten. The memories it stirred were old, buried deep in the back of her mind. She stepped back, her legs unsteady, and leaned against the door. The world around her seemed to blur, the shadows in the hallway shifting and closing in. She suddenly felt as though the walls were closing in on her, the air growing colder. Her heart pounded in her chest. The door was still open, and beyond it, the hallway stretched out into the darkness. The visitor was waiting, and this time she was no longer sure she could ignore it.